Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Legendarium podcast. I am Craig, your host. Today, I'm very excited because it's one of those episodes where I get to talk very, very little because I've got two people much, much smarter than I am here on the podcast. So I get to fire off the random stupid question every now and then just watch them go, like a wind-up toys, right? So, hot on the heels of the episode that I did with Aparna Verma, I'm now recording with her and Ronnie, R.R. Virdi. So you can find both of them online, and I'm going to link to all the stuff below. We're going to talk about their books at the end of this episode. But today, basically what happened, Aparna, last time you came on, and I told people this after the episode was over, you know, we hung up and then I put the episode together and I had to come on and say, like, look, I know we skated over a lot of issues. We didn't dive into anything, but you and I were talking afterwards and you're like, oh yeah, no, we got to get into some of this stuff. Let me call my friend Ronnie. So we've got Ronnie on now to talk about comparative mythology. Now, that it might at first glance seem to take us somewhat far afield from a sci-fi fantasy book club, but I would argue, no, it does not. And this is going to be very interesting stuff to anybody who wants to be a better reader, a better writer, a better, I don't know, citizen of the world, whatever, you know, you want to throw in there. It should be pretty good. So, Aparna, welcome back.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back.
Of course. And Ronnie, welcome for the first time.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. All right, guys. So let me kick it to Ronnie first. Oh, actually, you know what, Ronnie, before I do that, I'm going to kick it to myself and say, hey, everybody, go to thelegendarium.com and check out our Patreon link and the Discord link and the past episodes and the future episodes on the calendar. Okay, Ronnie, now I'm going to kick it to you and ask you a very, very elementary question, which is, what is comparative mythology?
Okay, so the name sort of does give it away, and it's the study of similar myths throughout different cultures. They can be through different time periods, because myths have this history of not only being shared and retold through cultures, but co-opted, subsumed, and then re-evolving over time. So the same myth might show up slightly altered, which has led to certain tropes being plucked from myths, and this continues throughout time until we have very similar storytelling structures and narrative devices that are prevalent in stories, not just in Western society, but Asian societies, Eastern European, and we usually see the surface similarities of them, but we don't realize a lot of times they come from these shared myths. Some of the oldest that are being studied when people think of comparative mythology are the ancient Greek, the Old Norse, and then the South Asian myths, because they come from a similar root. It's theorized from Proto IndoEuropean roots.
So Proto-Indo-European, for those who didn't take too many linguistics classes like I did, that would be like, you might have heard this term in a linguistic format where we're talking about this root language that's lost now. We don't know what it is, but Proto-Indo-European, there's a word for you. Proto-Indo-European is this theorized language from which stems a whole bunch of other languages.
Usually
including
Old Norse, Sanskrit, Greek, and then parts of Latin. And then we theorize that they came from the early Scythian people, because their DNA is found in still North Indians, most heavily right now in the Mongol population, and then obviously some of the Northeastern and Western European populations.
So is what you're saying that it's the same thing with the mythology as well? We're tracing mythology. We're doing asterisk mythology, as we might say in linguistics, all the way back to Proto-Indo-European?
Yep. And as a language geek, you'll find this fascinating, but there's a god who shows up in many different languages and cultures, and his original name is Deus Peter. And it literally translates to Sky Father. Deus and De eventually comes from the idea of sky. And Deus Peter is in Sanskrit. And Pitta is still the word for father, or Pittaji later, that's kept there, but he's still a South Asian sky deity. And he shows up in the Greek because the original name for Zeus was never Zeus. It was Deus Peter, and it eventually became Zeus Peter, and then truncated to Zeus. So Zeus's name is not really Zeus if you look it up. It's still a title, and his title was Sky Father. And this has continued to evolve into other places. So with the Roman Jupiter, his name was Deu Peter again, and then it became Du Peter, and then became Jupiter. And enough of the data exists. And then when you have a similar god, usually the mythology around them continues to evolve. So if we take the idea of a sky father down to the next level, we have what are the storm gods. So we have Baal and Hadad, who are famously a storm god killing a giant oceanic serpent, which is similar to Thor, who kills Jormungandr, a storm god who kills an oceanic serpent. And then we have in South Asian mythology Indra, who is our storm god, and he kills Vitra, who is one of the Asuras, a demon who takes the form of a giant serpent. And he's also called the first dragon. And when he's killed and slain by Indra, Indra also wields a hammer, which is imbued with all the powers of a lightning bolt. It's technically a proto club. Does that sound familiar? It's Thor's hammer Mjolnir. And all these actually pop up within 1000 AD or BC, around the same time as some of the older epics too. So there's this weird theory of why are these myths also popping up at the exact same time from cultures that are a little bit isolated. They didn't have direct trade. We do know the Greeks and the Indians specifically did trade, but there wasn't enough at that time to like their myths also spread up at the exact same time to make that happen. So most of the evidence points that they're coming out of an earlier proto-culture that must have spread, evolved, carried enough root core beats and language structures and early fables and folklores and stories and myths that they just became readopted and co-opted into different cultures when they settled, and we became more agricultural people. When we set down roots and different civilizations were no longer nomadic, they started creating farming empires because the myths also change. So the Dragon Slayer myth is one of the biggest cooperative mythology myths to trace the evolution of society, where if you go from what the dragon stole, originally the dragons hoarded water, which is a precious resource. As we became more agricultural, dragons started stealing livestock and cattle. And the myth evolves to usually heroes, knights, and people to go save the cattle. Then it evolves into princesses, because once we became more kingdom societies with larger wealth
More
and empires,
patriarchal.
we started valuing princesses instead as the currency, so the dragon steals that. And this has continued to modern day storytelling, where if you want to look at a very modern take of the dragon, not just obviously Smaug from Bilbo Baggins and The Hobbit, and this makes sense because Tolkien not only translated Beowulf, the Norse epics, he was a huge classical lit study guy, but the Death Star serves the exact same purpose story-wise as a dragon. On top of it is Princess Leia, and if you go back and as a language nerd, you'll appreciate this. You look at Vitra, he was also called the first obstacle. The whole point of that story was killing Vitra. He is the idea of a climax. Slaying the dragon is the climax of your story. And it is from that we got the idea structurally that continued evolving, that slaying the dragon is the end of the story. That is the big moment.
The hero structure.
The hero structure eventually became codified and reduced out of this. And then Star Wars, destroying the Death Star, is that moment. It's where Luke comes to his fulfillment of the Jedi way. He trusts the Force. He's already rescued the princess from it. And the Death Star holds the galaxy in danger, similar to the way the dragon would hold an empire or something else in danger. And I don't want to take the whole thing, but that's just one shared myth and how prevalent it's become to storytelling. So, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, go for it, Aparna.
I just wanted to point out that, as Ronnie's like showing some examples, one thing that to know as a writer is how different cultures share story structures and story narratives. So I think it's really useful to understand the history of where did the 3-act or quote unquote hero structure evolve from, and we know it's actually from these very Proto IndoEuropean myths that we go back eons and eons. I think it's also really important to then study the epics. If we look at the Odyssey and the Mahabharata, we realize there's some very, very similar frame narratives that the Wheel of Time later uses, and then from there on, we see so many other stories take from that. So I think it's just really cool to see the threads pull back into time, and also realize how borders weren't real borders back then in terms of story and ideas. They were more blurred, and that's how we get the stories that we have today.
First of all, this is all very, very fascinating. You've given me 18 different directions I can go. I do love the idea of the Sky Father, going way back to what you're talking about earlier, and how we can trace all these things back to this original god, the Sky Father. And it kind of makes me chuckle a little bit, because the anti-religious might look at the religious and make fun of them by saying, oh yeah, pray to your sky god, and cling to your
historically always
your boomsticks, your sky god. And it's like, no, you're tapping into something very, very old. You're not just being, supposedly clever. I don't know.
There's scientific study that shows that people are pre-wired for spirituality. How you want to define that is different because you can do it obviously through a codified religion system, and then you have more things like Buddhism, which people argue is not necessarily religion; it's a way of life. Because you can technically be both like Christian and as well as Buddhist because it's a life code path, and that gets very mucky depending on who you are and what you want to believe there. But spirituality transcends the idea of just religion. But it makes sense when you look at us back historically, like if you're people, your early proto people, you have no idea of how weather works or anything. It's probably to your at least survival comfort to have the idea there's something benevolent out there that's going to make it rain when you need crops, or a sheltering storm, or just a water source if you can't find one. And you can't explain thunderstorms any other way. So the idea of one of the earliest deities being a sky father, along with solar deities, which we know are some of the oldest. It just makes sense for people to want to gravitate towards that. It gives you a clarity, purpose. It's probably why it was so easy to co-opt in other cultures and share that idea of that god, because everybody needs a water source. Everybody likes the idea of if you're rooted in the firmament down here, there's only two ways you can go, down or up. And historically, at the same time we created the idea of above, we had the idea of down below, and like something similar to hell, and people don't like going down there. So it makes sense you're going to want to worship the guy up top, right? And another deity that we have that's shared in similar myths is the idea of the fire god. And historically, originally, it's a fire goddess. We found out a lot of proto cultures actually worshipped a female goddess first. And in South Asian culture, as well as some others, it was shown that not only was she female, a lot later changed her into a male god. There's certain linguistic things going on with certain fire deities in South Asian culture. I'm forgetting one right now. They're not proto, but they're just after that. And I actually wrote a Twitter thread all about it, which was super long. I should probably dig that up so I can bring it back up later in the conversation. But yeah, it was one of the earliest ones too, because once we discovered fire, the fire goddess usually incorporated the idea of more than fire, but what fire could represent for society. The idea of the hearth, so home, warmth, place to cook your food. So the idea of not just food, but what food meant in terms of providing. She was a god of nourishment. Also became a family hierarchy goddess. So the idea that with her, she also tended to the family, which is why same in Greek, you have, goddesses of the hearth and goddesses of marriage. Earlier proto god and goddesses usually incorporated many roles. And as we evolved, we sort of started piecemealing off bits of gods and started making them into just the god of war, or just the god of lightning, or just the god of this. But usually the earlier ones incorporated larger societal values and fewer roles.
Okay, so I want to run an idea past you guys. This is absolutely untested. I have no idea if I'm just talking out my ass here. But Aparna, I'll run it by you first. As you guys have been talking, you mentioned Aparna, you brought up the Wheel of Time. That's of course that's going to ping the pleasure centers of my brain as a Jordan fanatic. But the idea is this: there are popular writers and there are critically acclaimed writers. And sometimes, the Venn diagrams overlap, and that's fine. But for the most part, it's you've got the literary side on one side and then the popular authors on the other.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of quote unquote, and good Lord, I hate this word, but the literary writers. On the one side, do they tap into these at all? Because I'm thinking of Tolkien. I'm thinking of Robert Jordan. I'm thinking of now Brandon Sanderson, the biggest fantasy author in at least the English-speaking world, that kind of tap into these myths that Ronnie's talking about in a very transparent, often way. Yeah. Are these authors more likely to become popular because it's hitting some kind of like lowest common denominator or base programming that we have as humans, whereas others are avoiding that, or they believe they're transcending it, or they're engaging with it in some other way, or trying not to? Does that make any sense? Like,
no, it does.
It definitely makes sense. It definitely makes sense. And I think when you think back to stories like Lord of the Rings with Tolkien, I think what that story does really well is tap into like almost like a very ancient storytelling structure that's at once both familiar, but Tolkien makes newer in the way that he uses like different races of elves, orcs, dwarves, whatnot. I think there's this one narrative structure that actually when I took this mythology class back in college, and our mythology teacher told us this one narrative structure called leaving the village, and that translates now where I'm forgetting who said this, but every story is either a stranger comes into town or the hero goes on an adventure, and that derives from the narrative structure of leaving the village. So what does leaving the village actually mean? It happens, it's also a lifetime. If you think about life coaching, it's an arc that all of us go through, where the village is your center, the village is your home, your heart. It's everything that you're familiar with, but there comes a point in time, either in your journey, the hero's journey, your own life, where you have to leave the village and leave the familiar grounds and go into the forest or whatever journey you have ahead of you. So it's a moment of reflection. It's a moment of fear because you're about to step on this unknown path. And how many times have we seen that in our own lives? Then we see that mirrored in stories. And that structure, leaving the village, is so familiar to us because we do it all the times. In stories, we just make it more apparent. It's not as sexy of like, I'm going to go to a different city because I have a new job where I don't know anyone. It's like, no, Bilbo goes to go on an adventure, or Frodo goes with the Fellowship of the Ring, like where there's fighting, there's dragons. It's a lot more, it's a lot sexier, and I think that's why we're drawn to stories like that. I will say now, the idea of with Wheel of Time, like unknown farm boy realizes he's powerful, and we've seen that trope now. When we look at tropes of it's always like the village boy or like the innocent girl who's actually like a raging god or goddess powers.
Right.
It's like, how many times have we seen that? So I think now in more so modern 21st century storytelling, we're looking at stories that kind of flip that on the head because we've seen it so many times. So for me, as a writer, what's more interesting is if someone knows the storytelling structure of the village, leaving the village, if they know the hero's journey, how do you complicate that? How do you add another layer of complexity that adds a new way to looking at stories that we've seen before from Tolkien or Jordan?
Mm-hmm. And it's always interesting to look at those stories that try and do something else, and to recognize that although you are trying to complicate that, dare I say, original story structure, you're trying to complicate it, you're trying to flip it on its head, you're trying to do something with it, but you're still in conversation with it, whether
Yeah.
you're playing along or you're playing against. It's still if you're playing against it and you're flipping it on its head, it's not going to make as much sense if people don't understand that original story structure. So they need to read those old epics or watch Star Wars or read Harry Potter or whatever to get the. Go ahead, Ronnie.
In the lineage of the previous stories, which is part of why they work too. So one of the biggest things that Wheel of Time was criticized for early on was its similarities in the early books to Lord of the Rings.
Sure.
But that was also part because Jordan loved Lord of the Rings, and same with people forget Shannara. I always say it's Shannara, but it's Shannara. The Shannara series originally.
Oh, he gave up. He gave up as soon as the TV show came out.
Did?
He's like, "Oh, okay. Fine, it's Shannara."
Because he corrected me once too, and I was like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. Oops."
Yeah.
And he says it to you at your face. You're like, "Yes, sir."
MTV backed a big truck of money up to him and said, "Hey, can we call it Shannara?" And he's like, "Yeah, okay."
Yeah, but this is exactly what happened with the original myths. They caught on, and they kept getting retold and re-co-opted, and it's actually a literary tradition. What people don't know is, for example, The Witcher is very similar in many ways to Michael Moorcock's Elric of Melibone, down to the White Wolf moniker that Geralt has was also with Elric, and a lot of the idea of the convergence of spheres. And part of that is because I can't remember the author's name, how to say it, the Polish author who wrote it. Is it Sapkowski?
Yes, Sapkowski, whatever.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not totally sure.
But he actually translated Elric into Polish. So he had kind of a connection to those series. And when you look at Tolkien, people forget not only did he translate Beowulf, there's also an old, it's a German language drama by Wagner, and it's called Das Ring der Nibelung. And what it is called the Ring Cycle. and it is a German epic, a fantasy play about the four cycles of this great ring forged by evil that can take over the world and destroy everything. Does that sound familiar? Like when Tolkien wrote The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, he was sort of writing in conversation with Beowulf, because a lot of the characters in the final beats of The Hobbit are pretty similar to Beowulf, down to Smaug, who represents Fafnir, the great dragon
Yeah.
who hoards wealth. And originally, Fafnir is killed by Sigurd in the myths. This goes back to the Dragon Slayer myth, and also ties into another myth, the myth of impenetrability, which goes both ways. For Sigurd killing Fafnir, he bathes in its blood and he gets like immortal dragon skin. He becomes impervious, but for one spot where an oak leaf sticks to his back, and he's left vulnerable there, and he can be stabbed and killed later. Frodo, instead, after Smaug's death, not Frodo, Bilbo, he's gifted what? Mithril. He's gifted a suit that is nearly impenetrable of armor. The idea of, in relation to killing the dragon, you can gain some kind of impenetrability is a very old myth. And then in this case, with Smaug, Tolkien gave him one weakness as well. He's supposed to be, hard as steel, but he has that one weakness where if you make that one shot, you can kill Smaug.
It's also similar to Achilles, right? Like with the
Achilles
heel.
is the myth of, and by the way, the original version of Achilles.
Yeah,
that's the wrong version.
Yeah.
So there is a Roman play called the Achilleid, which was written after the original Odyssey and Iliad. So in the original ones, Achilles is never dipped in the river Styx. He does have impenetrability, but it's very similar to a Raman, or Ramayama as it would be said in the West, which is a titular epic of the same time, similar to the Odyssey. And in there, one of the main characters, Karan, who it's spelled Karna in the West, he's given a suit of divine armor that is impenetrable. Now, in the original Iliad, so is Achilles. His mother beseeches Hephaestus to make a suit to protect her son. And in the old statues and old art of Achilles, he's actually pierced through the opening between the armor when he gives it up. He's shot through the waist. He's never shot through the heel and killed that way. He himself is actually mortal. It's his armor that's impenetrable, and after losing that in some iterations or being shot between it is how he's killed. So that's another comparative myth, the idea of the impenetrability with one fallibility. Loki and Balder
sorry to interrupt. Isn't Gurna from Mahabharata though, not from the Ramayana?
Sorry, what did you say? You broke up.
Isn't Gurna from the Mahabharata?
Oh, Mahabharata, yes, Mahabharata, you're right. Because both epics have a similar.
The white guy wasn't going to say anything.
No, you're fine. You're right. So the two that get compared are, we have the Iliad and the Odyssey, and then we have Raman and Mahabharata, and both are like the successors to each other. So you have the Iliad and the Odyssey being two parts of the epic stories of Greek. We have Raman and Mahabharata, which are our two, and some of the characters and their historical events tie over. But yeah, you're right. It's Mahabharata.
So Ronnie, could I throw a modern day trope at you, the way we've talked about leaving the village or the farm boy or whatever, some modern day trope? And how confident are you that you could take any given well established trope and say, oh yeah, this is where that comes from?
We'll see. But I'm willing to give it a try.
Yeah,
I love doing.
I should have gathered a whole bunch of tropes. I know.
Well, that's what my series is actually about. So Tales of Tremaine is a love letter to the idea of the proto-hero being rebuilt today. And I actually framed this argument many times in the series that all these stories, I don't say fantasy because I'm not trying to insult the genre. I love it. But as a mythology nut growing up, I've always seen all the similarities, especially to my culture, which was never represented, though, in South Asian works. But I always saw, like, oh, I know this myth because I grew up with it. And I'm like, cool, what if I did this as a love letter to storytelling by using all the historical storytelling techniques, the tropes, the beats, the archetypes, and then I posit that theory in there. And then my character serves as both a classic and new proto-hero, essentially fulfilling or failing those. So that's why I'm so comfortable doing this, because this is genuinely just a love of mine. I'd probably be studying mythology if I could have afforded college, but I couldn't. So. College is pricey, man. I don't know what a mythology professor makes, so let's put that in perspective too. It's what I would have gotten out of it.
It's a good question, and they flew him over from Britain, so he was a visiting professor. So it's a good.
There you go.
And he what I really enjoyed about that was that he told us the Odyssey the way it was supposed to be told orally with a song drum. So we would sit in a circle, and he was in the middle, and he would beat his drum and tell us.
Because these are all epic poems.
Yeah, and it was very it was beautiful in the way that later we were applying the same narrative structures that we find in the Odyssey to tell our own stories. So I actually used leaving the village to tell a story that my uncle told me about this one man, whether it's true or not, a big man named Arun. And how he left his village and settled as a thief and settle in a different village. And when one day when his family's gone, thieves go into his home, and how he kind of reflects back on his own like past life. And when he decides to give grace to the thieves, it's because he's forgiving and giving grace to himself. So it's just really important to me to see those things link up, because I think sometimes we try to overthink it, of saying like, we try to overcomplicate our stories. I think the best way to, when we reflect back, is that they're very simple to its core, and they have these beats across cultures, across myths. You just need to open your ear up to start seeing that, you know? One of my favorite ones, I don't know if I talked about it in our last episode, Craig, but one of my favorite ones is the idea of negotiating with death. I think that's a trope that we see often in modern
Say
storytelling.
It again. It's what now?
Negotiating with death.
With death. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So like you're either going up against the Death Lord, the Dark Lord, however you want to call it, and they took away your precious, loved one, and you are trying to negotiate for their life back. How many times have we seen that story? The most common one is Orpheus and Eurydice, where Orpheus goes into the underworld to find his wife, and right before he steps across the threshold, and thresholds are very, very important symbolically in storytelling, right before he's about to step across the threshold, he just wants to turn around. He just wants to make sure that his beloved wife is following him, and that she hasn't gotten lost. And it's just such it's a very human emotion to make sure your family member is safe. And then he turns around and he dooms her for eternity because she disappears. And he can never see her again. She can never come back to his world. Now, there's a very similar myth in the Mahabharata, in South Asian myth lore, with Savitri and Satyavan. But it's a little different in terms of the ending. And I think it's very symbolic of like how some of these cultures differ in terms of Indian culture versus Greek culture, and how that also influenced Christianity. In Christianity, there's, as an outsider looking into Christianity, it seems that the pursuit of knowledge is looked down upon. Like if you try to achieve the level of knowledge as God, you're going to be struck down. Yeah, go ahead.
Isn't that I've always assumed that was a version of, it was like a cautionary version of leaving the village, right? If you gain a certain amount of knowledge, or a certain type of knowledge, that's a threshold, to use that word, that's going to take you outside of the village. You can never come back because now you know too much. Adam and Eve bite the apple, and whatever. So these tropes, if you will, are all tied together as well. Not just one-to-one back through time, but they're all interlaced, right?
Yes, and I would say that it's interesting because in how in Western storytelling we have that perspective, but in South Asian storytelling, if you pursue the knowledge of the gods, you're given a boon. So many times we've seen ascetics, traveling monks, if they go into deep levels of meditation, they chant the names of their god. They're like to them that is a pursuit of knowledge, to see their god before them. And if they study hard enough, if they meditate hard enough, what happens is that the god appears before them and gives them a boon. Now what happens is that it's not the god doesn't punish them, they're giving that knowledge, they're rewarded for their knowledge by a boon. It's man himself who curses himself by whatever boon he takes. So one example is Raktabij. He was this king of demons, and I think it was Brahma. He was a student of Brahma, and he meditated for a very, very long time. And this is like years. And to the point that Brahma took notice, and Brahma decided to give him a boon. And Raktabij, if I remember correctly, asked to be invincible and that no man or monster can kill him. He never says a woman.
That's
and I
right.
think we talked about
that.
this.
Yeah.
And that's when Kalima defeats him. But see, it's his own hubris. It's his own pride. It's humanity that curses themselves. It's not the pursuit of knowledge itself,
Right. It's
Um,
not the gods. It's not the knowledge. It's, yeah,
it's
it's
it's a little
ourselves.
different, yeah. So sorry, just going back to the death myth. What's interesting to me is that a lot of cultures have that. The Japanese have that. The Native Americans have one. In
Egyptians
South,
and Norse.
the Egyptians, the Norse. It's all across different cultures, and it's interesting to me to see the little differences. So Orpheus, he turns around, his wife is gone. Savitri and Satyavan, she continues to pursue Lord Yama, who is the god of death, kind of like Hades. And instead of punishing her, he gives her three boons. And she, being very clever, he basically says, I'll give you anything, you just can't ask for your husband's life back. So he has that condition, and she's being very clever. One, I think the first boon she asks is that her husband's parents, her in-laws, get their sight back. The second is that their kingdom gets restored. The third and final one, she asks for 100 sons. And this is where she tricks Yama, because when Yama says, okay, I'll give you 100 sons, she stops him. It's like, how am I going to have 100 sons without my husband? What do you want me to do? And he realizes in that moment, oh yeah, you're right. And instead of punishing her for tricking him or like being more clever, he gives her husband back, and they live to have 100 sons, which I don't, clap off to
But
Savitri
yeah,
for having
don't think about
100,
it too hard.
yeah, for 100 sons. But do you see how how the myths meld together, but then they splinter off in ways that's very resonant to the culture? Where in South Asian culture, the pursuit of gods, the pursuit of knowledge, the pursuit of gods is synonymous to the pursuit of knowledge, is not punished; it's rewarded.
Or just
Versus
deal
more so,
making.
or deal
Because we
making,
have
exactly.
two. We actually have another as well. We have the story of Primavada and Ruru,
And Ruru,
and
yeah, yeah.
she is killed similar to Eurydice, where she's bitten by a snake. And in here, Ruru does it as a much simpler story. He beseeches again Yama, the Lord of the Dead, and instead he just goes, "Can I deal for my wife back?" And he's like, "You've got to give me something really precious." It's a shorter, less romantic story. But it's like, "I'll give you half my life to get half hers back," and she's brought back, and they spend their remaining time together. It's shorter. But there's an interesting inversion. It's very dark because the Norse myths get dark, but it's called Brynhilder's Ride to Hell. And she
Mm.
was a Valkyrie warrior who was in love with Sigurd, the Dragon Slayer. And when they both die, they didn't die on the best of terms. And she's burned on a wagon, which means she gets to actually go on a journey. And through hell, she's actually trying to reunite with his soul. Because in other mythologies outside of, let's say, the Western canon, hell or the underworld isn't necessarily a place of punishment. Like in the Greek, Hades isn't a place of punishment. It's just where you go in the afterlife. Everyone goes there, good or bad, and your afterlife is determined, of course, by your behavior in your life. But in here, she's actually tested to show the commitment of her love, and she's given many different challenges as well as questions to sort of bear her soul. And in it, she doesn't necessarily have the greatest of times, but she is sort of reunited for a happy one last, like, we're reunited in hell, but I've gotten the burdens off my chest. So the two lovers still get to spend a different kind of eternity to each other, depending on the variation you read. They don't get their lives back, but that's not what the story is about. It's more reconciliation and reuniting of lovers that way. The Japanese have Izanami and Izagai, and then the Egyptians have
Mm-hmm.
a very um, adult one with Osiris and Isis, where part of him is removed in his death, a very male part of him, and to bring him back to life, she has to create an artificial version of that part of him, and he is restored back. But it's a female take on where the woman succeeds in bringing back her lover just with artificial enhancement, I guess. But
I think
the theme,
I saw a commercial about this on cable news once. They were way behind the times. Apparently, the Egyptians
Yeah,
were just ahead
they
of
yeah,
were
the
ahead
game.
of it.
yeah. But most of the most popular myths we have, whether it's romance or everything in storytelling today, usually subsists because we've loved it from our oldest myths. We worshipped and venerated it from the highest of our gods, and as we started bringing them down to demigods, to heroes, and then mortal heroes and knights and champions, we usually have reduced the best qualities of the highest into forms more similar to ourselves and our stories, and it still continues
Mm.
today. Um,
So, oh, sorry, go on.
no, I was just mostly bringing it back to your question of how those authors usually comment on these myths and they go super popular versus the more literary. I think it's because they're just mass appealing to stuff we've also just heard over and over because we inherently love it. So it's not even the myth itself; it could just be the trope taken from the myth, but we've psychologically all seen so many variations of it, and we just love it. The biggest example is anime. I don't know if you're a fan of it, but there's two very popular styles. There's shonen, which has been usually dubbed boys anime, and shoujo, which is dubbed women's, and they follow very similar tropes. So, Dragon Ball Z spawned a whole iteration of the similarities between Yu Yu Hakusho to it, Bleach, Naruto, One Piece, which is now the world's largest selling actually form of literature. It recently just passed in manga form at 500 million copies. It's the only thing in the world to rival Harry Potter, longest running anime. And all of its tropes are inspired by Dragon Ball Z. It's just a different milieu or setting. It's pirate adventures, but the level up system, the power up system, grand tournaments, those are very Japanese manga tropes. And it comes back to this very same idea of shared storytelling and mythology that people love what they love, and they're going to just put their spin on it and retell it. And that's what comparative mythology really is. It's just from the myth angle versus the story. I don't know if we lost him. Okay.
Yeah, no. 35 minutes later, I said, "What's comparative mythology?" And there you just said, "So that's what comparative mythology is." This is great. This
all
is like
fiction.
Exactly, right. Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna fire off some, just a few really, really basic tropes, and you tell me if you can think of a basis in mythology for these. Now, Aparna, you are up too. You can do this too. The orphan. Heroes are so often orphans. Why are they orphans?
Oh, so that usually falls into divine parentage. There's one that's a great one, but we can do the adopted child. So the idea of Moses put down the river basket to be adopted.
I was about to say Krishna,
and this is the exact same thing too. So in that story, his mother Kunti is given a divine boon by the sun god Surya. It's a virginal birth. Also sound familiar? A god birthing a virginal birth son of himself, and that's Krishna. But also he was also out of her shame, I guess, having a child out of wedlock, she puts him in a basket and sends him downriver, and he's technically orphaned for a little while. Some of our earliest myths, I can't track which one's the first because, again, going back to proto myths, we have some very old stories that pop up at the same time. But yeah, we're talking way before BC, like several thousand years. We have the idea of the orphaned hero, usually from divine parentage. That's something they find out later, which also, you can also do with the Skywalker saga. Anakin Skywalker is sort of orphaned early, no father. We know his mother. His mother dies while he's still a teenager in Padawan training. And then Luke is similarly raised in a way of where he's with his aunt and uncle. Luke finds out he has divine parentage in terms of his father is the greatest Jedi of all time. Canonically, he just doesn't realize his father's not a bad guy. It's how you twist the trope, but whether we want to take the modern relative back to the oldest, they're usually tied in that we create the orphan for this idea of self-fulfillment and letting him without his parentage first hanging over his head to find himself, to have a more adult realization of who he is later, or she.
It's a starting of the hero's journey that it originates from there.
All right, so next one, we go from the orphan to the other side of the hero's journey coin, and that's the wizard. In fact, we can stick with Star Wars. Star Wars is a great example of two tropes at the same time, which is the good wizard and the evil wizard.
Yeah.
Wizard, my understanding of this concept only goes back as far as Old English, which basically gives us wizard, a wise person.
You have it right there, because what does the wizard serve? The wizard serves the role as the advisor, the wise man, or the mentor. And that's what the original arc, if we're using the hero's journey, is when a mentor comes in. And usually historical figures, if we look at the Greek epics and South Asians, your main character has some kind of mentor, from an archery tutor, because that was one of the best ways of warfare, philosophy, history of warfare, combat arms. When you're shaping, especially these were very patriarchal societies at the time, you're shaping a young man specifically. He's usually going to have a lot of mentor characters, and they play a huge role in their lives.
It's the idea of gurus, of gurus. And it comes from that South Asian, we see in our stories, but it's also the idea of like the wise one is your guru, it's your teacher, and it's much more. It's deeper than your teacher. It's like your soul mentor. It's like they guide you in a very deep and personal way that leads to that self-fulfillment journey that Ronnie was talking about earlier.
And we actually see these in society. So the Greeks obviously had their education system, and then people don't realize this, but the world's largest library that was actually burned, larger than Alexandria, is a South Asian one called Nalanda, which
Mm-hmm.
is, you can still look it up. It's absolutely fascinating. But they had the largest collection of scripts, tomes from different cultures, and they were sort of a public university that fed monks. They had students from all over come. There's actually a history of Greek students who studied in South Asia for so long they were unaware that after they passed and died that
That yeah,
there's
great, yeah,
that Greece has fallen, or the Greece that they knew.
Mm.
There was a huge trade route of Indus, Greco-Indus routes down there, which is absolutely amazing to find out of how much correspondence went on between them culturally and stuff. But that idea of the mentor comes from that, and the wizard we just conferred upon the magical powers, because in the oldest epics
yeah.
they kind of did. I mean, look at Hercules' trainer, right? We can use whether you want to use a classical myth or the Disney version. Both have a mythical role, mythical connection into shaping him into arguably one of the most famous heroes that we still understand today.
You know what's interesting, Ronnie, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm just stipulating here. What's interesting to me, and I'm going back to like South Asian mythology, is like when we see these gurus, we see these usually like monks or they're like very religious
Mhm.
men. And when they study, when they chant a lot, and when they meditate a lot, they're given that boon. And usually it's like, I want a child.
Mhm.
And I wonder if
Mm.
that also comes from that idea of like the mentorship of like how that mentor is always destined to be attached to a child that may or may not be their own. I don't know. Do you feel like there's a thread there, or am I just kind of
There is. I don't know if it's a myth thread or more
yeah,
psychological, because I understand that too.
yeah,
Because in my actual life, I've had that one of my closest mentors doesn't have children of his own, and he's definitely looked out for me in the very father-like role. That might be a very humanistic, maybe even just male psychology-driven thing. Like we always want to be the guy to pass it down to the next guy. In my actual book, I've definitely done that where I've dedicated the first binding to Jim Butcher, who actually saved my life and had a huge impact on me. And I can absolutely say without doubt he's been a mentor and very strong personal figurehead in my life, especially the last 5 years specifically when I really started transitioning from indie self-publishing to traditional mentoring me. So I think you're definitely hitting the nail on the head. I don't want to necessarily assume the mythological connection. I think it's the
yeah, yeah.
opposite, where maybe
Mm.
the mythological stories have it because that's a very human
Affected the
psychological.
psychological. Yeah.
Yeah, like that's something that's just in us as humans to do. We
This is
see it
why I
now in
love
more.
myths.
Yeah, we see it now in
Yeah.
more female-driven stories where the idea of the motherhood figure who serves also as a mentor, but she's not necessarily the
Yeah.
biological figure. Because Gail
Yeah.
Carriger has an amazing breakdown of the heroine's journey, which was actually
Yeah.
created by a student of Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell. She did the female take of it, and I did a talk with the heroine's journey on SFF Addicts, and I broke it all down there. But it's a similar idea. There is usually a stronger, older female role model that can help
That's
younger women
literally
come into her own.
Firma. That's Firma in the Phoenix King. Like she is not Alina's mother, but she is her closest confidant, mentor, teacher, mother figure after losing her own mother. But she's not orphaned. She's her dad's still around.
Mm.
Her I was gonna curse. Her tyrannical father.
Yeah, well, it's I can think of 4 words off the top of my head that you might have thrown in
Yeah.
there. All right, last trope that I'm going to throw at you guys, and this one similarly might be, oh, does this have mythological bases,
Hmm.
or is this just kind of a psychological thing? But my all-time favorite fantasy trope is the tavern, and I can
Oh,
see where it's
It's a
just,
gathering
when
place.
you're going on an adventure. I think of uh, well, let's take the Lord of the Rings. Actually, let's go back to the Lord of the Rings. Always my favorite. And
the prancing
our
pony.
taverns, like we have the Green Dragon back
Yep,
in the Shire, right? Before they ever leave the Shire, they have this
that's the fun one.
community place, right? But then the role of the tavern can be one of 2 things in most fantasy stories. Either it's that communal place back at home, and you go
Hmm.
there and back again, there and back again. You're always coming back to the tavern, or it can be a place like Tom Bombadil's house or
Yep.
Bree or Rivendell. These are
Hmm.
taverns where they're waypoints on the journey as you go. And I'm curious if how far back the idea of the tavern goes.
So in storytelling, I can't actually say because the earliest myths don't use that. However,
Right.
I think once we became societal based, like when the dragons evolved to kidnapping princesses, when we developed societies of that scale where we would have rest and waypoints, the tavern became a localized fixture that became modernized in new storytelling, because it became the place where stories were told. So there's a fascinating history. The book is called the Ibn Fadlan, and it's about Ibn Faduda, Ibn
Mhm.
Battuta, who was the Marco Polo before Marco Polo from the Middle East, and he went as far as Russia, because people don't realize how far old traders used to go, because it was an extremely lucrative job if you were willing to
Yeah.
take the risk, because you could take spices 3,000 miles to another country where they don't have them. The amount kings and wealthy people would pay for that is ridiculous. You could make a ridiculous living doing it. And one
And
character
yet
he
the
brings
British
along with him.
still didn't. Sorry, I was just saying. Yet the British still they colonized the world, took this, didn't even learn spices yet. Like they still learned
But
nothing. Sorry, I had to add that in
no,
there.
you're fine. One of the fascinating things in that book is you realize he brought along with him a traveling storyteller. And this is the idea of why storytellers are so important, and part of why I'm doing what I'm doing with Tales of Tremaine is it's the original rock star. People after long hard days of work, or they're getting up for like a late, if you work harvest and you're working afternoons, you're going to go to the tavern and someone to entertain, and bringing a storyteller with you, that's a currency. You could peddle stories from other cultures to new cultures that will de-escalate tension. It will enrapture people. It will sell up the price of your goods if they're rare and exotic. It will hold their imaginations. It will ingratiate you to people. And taverns were the number one place where you're guaranteed people are going to be there. People are going to be drinking. They're going to want to be in a good mood. And you can
Uh-huh.
essentially control a little mini pocket society, and you can gain information. I think that was an evolution of actual things that happened, because we have records of people who relied on storytellers and oral performances to just change their environment and do deals and trade money,
Yeah.
and so much that it would become ingrained in us to want to have this in stories. There's a romanticism about it. Tales of Tremaine is literally a love letter to oral storytelling for oral pleasure. And unfortunately, the old myths don't get into that, but I do think humans, we love it so much, because, like you said, it's a mini community, and it is bred for storytelling, that we've made it important to all our stories. I mean, I certainly did.
I think it's the idea of the gathering place, and the gathering place is where you
It's the
feel
new
safe,
fire.
or it's the new fire. It's either it's a point in the story where a change happens, there's a shift, there's a pivot, there's a new plot point introduced, or you see it's the beginning and the ending. It's a gathering place where we start from there and back again. I think Ronnie, what you were saying about, I just wanted to point out, like the oral storytelling. I don't know if it feels more of like a psychological thing where like the way that we pass down stories from the Odyssey to the Ramayana of Valmiki, Homer, like Homer, we always look up to these storytellers because in a way they were the vehicles of knowledge, and it's because of the stories that they spread, that the stories that they told for generations to come. That's how we find our lineage. That's how we're connected to our
Mm.
culture. It's the stories are that one thread that connects us all. And I think that's why we romanticize the idea of like the tavern, the gathering place, the fire, because there's something so ancient in that idea of like, this is how we spread information. This is how we found out this place is safe. This place isn't. There are thieves on this road. Avoid that road.
Mm.
It was a point of survival, and now it's a point of pleasure.
It's it's fascinating to think about the evolution of, you call it the new fire, right? We gather around the fire in the cave. Well, now we're an agrarian society. We have towns and cities and city states and whatnot. So now we have waypoints and inns and taverns, and of course now we've evolved once again, and we have Twitter. So there's your.
No, no, we have X. We have X now.
That's right. Sorry.
Yeah.
I thought that might get that reaction. Okay, guys, we're gonna start wrapping up, but let me
Yeah.
ask you this:
Mhm.
for those who have listened to this episode and been as engaged as I am, because I find this stuff fascinating, and I know I'm not the only one. Where should people go for, like, if they say, oh, I've never looked into comparative mythology once at any moment in my life, and I want to start? What's their 101? Is there a book? Is
Ooh.
there a podcast you recommend? Is there a website that you like to go to? Something that can help somebody find their footing and start on this kind of journey?
So I would actually say right now, because we live in the information age of where people consume visual content and podcasts so much easier on the go, I would not recommend going the way I did, which I started with classical books first. And there's actually a great expert on this named John White, who is on YouTube under the channel Ford. And looking him up, this is specifically what he deals with, is comparative mythology through Proto IndoEuropean. So you might not get most modern ones, but you'll see a lot of the tropes we've talked about, and many that I didn't get to yet, that just fill up all of our modern day fiction and where they come from, down to the tiniest things of like guard dogs of hell and how important dogs were in multiple different cultures, and why we have Cerberus and so many others. It's a fascinating channel, but Krakenford is where I'd recommend most starting.
Right on. Aparna, do you have one?
I was gonna say, see, I was trained as a journalist, so I was like, go to the primary sources. So, like, read the source materials, read like some of the Ibn Battuta's like adventures, read the Ramayana, read the Mahabharata, read the Odyssey. Also, I think also more modern is like Shakespeare. He draws a lot from these quote unquote like tropified, or in a way, like he took the ancient storytelling structures and made it into his day and age. And from him, we drew some of the storytellings and the stories that we see now, like Romeo and Juliet, the ill-fated lovers. Every culture has it. We just talk about Salvatore and Septima. We just talk about Orpheus and Eurydice, the ill-fated lovers. Like it's been told for eons and eons. It's just like once you start going back enough, just open your ears, open your eyes. You guys are very, very smart. You're natural storytellers. Just be aware. You're gonna pick it up real quick. It's once you start reading, you're gonna start noticing everything, and it's a lot of fun.
And I think I would add to that once you get a basis in some of these things, obviously the knowledge that you two have far outstrips my own, but I have enough that uh, I can be more appreciative, perhaps, of a really tropey story, something that is super stock standard. What's the name of the book that came out when I was in high school? Aragon.
Yeah.
Can get lit up from many different directions, but one of the ways that people come after it, they're like, it's just trope after trope. There's nothing original in it, and I'm like, who cares?
Yeah.
Like, it's a fun
That's
story
the
and it's
history of
standard.
mythology,
He does it
to be
well.
honest.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, I remember the name of that one professor's name is Martin Shaw. He is a British professor, and he is very much into comparative mythology. That's how really I started my interest. So any of his books, his name is Martin Shaw. He really delves into the way that myths cross, but he also focuses on the role of the storyteller or the bard. And I think there's this one book, all those barbarians, which is like actually about the storyteller and the role the storyteller plays in like pushing out stories.
Yeah, very nice. All right, guys. Well, we should wrap it up at this point, but we should do that by talking about your books and making sure people can get out there and check them out if they've enjoyed this discussion. Aparna, we already mentioned yours, but hey, it's repetition is that's a sales tool. Okay,
Yeah.
So we're gonna do it again. Give me the elevator pitch on the Phoenix King.
Yeah, well, The Phoenix King is an Indian-inspired sci-fi fantasy set in a futuristic desert kingdom where an ex-assassin, an heiress, and a tyrant struggle for power when an ancient, vengeful goddess reawakens and threatens to send a prophet to take back her kingdom.
Very nice. Yes, I do remember talking a little bit about that. That's a great premise.
It comes out August 29th, so mark your calendars. It's real soon.
Yeah, well, by the time I think this will come out after the book is out, so it is out now, and people should go get it. Absolutely,
go get it.
The Phoenix King. All right, Ronnie, yours is called the newest book is called The First Binding.
Yep.
Give us a little pitch on that one.
So, similar to what I talked about, it follows a legendary storyteller in the present day, and he starts off in a tavern, mostly doing a job audition, and you start realizing throughout the book as he starts falling in love with the singer, she discovers that all these famous legendary stories that he's talking about and telling all sound very similar and famous to the same person, and she realizes it's him, and he's a legendary sort of proto-hero, and he starts confiding in her all her greatest adventures and his journeys and all the different epithets and legends he's become. Mostly me just writing love letters, storytelling. And in the present day, you realize he claims to have committed the greatest sin, and he's secretly trying to solve that in the present day, and that hasn't been revealed what that is. He's working his way towards, and it's full of court politics, drama, assassinations, murder, multiple different storytelling techniques, nesting stories. It's a love letter to, obviously, the structure of Mahabharata, which is a framed narrative. It's the world's oldest And there aren't that many, unfortunately, in the West today. There's like 2 or 3
Yeah.
frame narratives that have been done, and that's it. And this is my just chance to do my giant epic. It's been said it's like Silk Road meets The Witcher books, or Silk Road of Wheel of Time, is how it's been pitched, at least by Tor.
And that's a pretty good pitch. I'd say they know how to come up with a tagline, right? Silk Road meets The Witcher. That'll move some copies. That's really
like
cool.
I said, it's like the books. So I do want to clarify that less sword swinging than the show, because the show and the books get a little bit different.
Yeah.
As is always the case. Now let's talk the Wheel of Time. I'm sorry, we've run out of time for today. No, thank you both for coming on. And like I said earlier, I want everybody to check these books out. If you've been interested in this discussion, should be a lot of meat on those bones for you to chew through. So, Aparna, thank you very much for coming back on.
Yeah, thanks for having me again. This is fun.
And Ronnie, thank you for coming on for the first time. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much for having me, man.
All right. And for those of you listening or watching on YouTube, I'll link to the books. I was about to say to the authors' websites, but I know it's been a while since Ronnie updated his.
Yeah.
But there'll be links in the description for you to check all this out. So you don't have to remember the name of everything. It'll be down there. So please do so. Otherwise, once again, go to thelegendarium.com. You can check out past episodes. There is a page, by the way, with all of these author interviews, the author shelf episodes that I've been doing the last year or two. So there's a whole page of those. If you like this type of discussion, it's there at thelegendarium.com. If you enjoy what we do and you want to support the show, please do go to Patreon. The link is there, as well as the link to Discord, so you can join. I don't know what we're at, 1,500 other weirdo nerds just like you who want to talk stories all day, every day. That's what we do there. So
it's our gathering place. It's our tavern. This is our tavern.
It's a whole lot better than Twitter. I'll tell you that right now.
Yeah.
All right, everybody. And thank you so much for listening. I will talk to you next time.